All right. Welcome, everybody. I just want to, on behalf of Walk the Talks, acknowledge the fact that these sessions we have are held on traditional territories of the Inuit, Dene, and all the local indigenous groups who occupied these lands in a sustainable manner for thousands of years. So we want to just express our gratitude and thanks for them living in a sustainable manner, and we like to hope that we'll do the same, follow in their footsteps. So at that, I'll hand it over.
Hello, everybody. I'm not sure which direction you're going to look after it, right? Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Wesley Bell, from the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Association. He's a conservation analyst, grew up in Botswana, and a large part of his youth was spent outdoors, camping, and just exploring the area around his home. And that was what prompted him to go into studying and getting a master's degree in conservation biology, followed by a PhD and a postdoctoral. And he's focused on land degradation mapping. So he recently joined the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society Northern Alberta chapter based out of Edmonton just in November. So we're very happy to have him with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's it's nice to have a presentation in person, but also thanks to those joining online. As Georgia said, I am Wesley. I'm from CPAWS's Northern Alberta chapter. I'm the conservation policy analyst. And yeah, I grew up in Botswana and went to school in South Africa. I'm South African. And we moved to Edmonton a year and a half ago, my wife and our 2-year-old. Since then, we've got another daughter, so we've got 2 daughters now. And yeah, I've been working for CPAWS since November last year. So a lot of this is new to me. So there's a very good chance that you guys can teach me a lot about what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm very open to that. And I'm not sure how the structure kind of usually works, but hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. And if I can't answer any of those, I'll hopefully be able to kind of point you in the right direction for where to find answers for them. So we're talking about sustainable forestry and kind of reframing sustainability in the Alberta forest sector through an ecological lens. I'm going to see if this gets us going. Yeah. Ha. Cool. So yeah, for today's talk, I'm going to give a little bit of a background, look at some of the kind of vegetation zones in Canada and Alberta, and then looking at forests just very broadly as ecosystems, what that kind of means. A little bit more on caribou, because that's something that we are focused on at CPAWS, and that generally is just a kind of a big species in conservation in Canada. I'm then going to look into forestry, like the industry. Again, a little bit of a brief background for Canada, and then more specific details for Alberta. Then going into some of the laws and regulations. I won't spend too much time on that. This is, could become a bit tedious. And then going to look at forestry certification, so sustainability certification for forestry companies, and kind of use all of that to get an understanding of what sustainable forestry is from the different perspectives. What we think needs to change, within the law and within the kind of certification systems, but just generally with an understanding of what sustainable forestry could be in Alberta. And then a brief look at what we do, some of the stuff that we do at CPAWS, and kind of pointing you towards, if you are interested, some of the other stuff that CPAWS has done in the past and that we're involved with at the moment. So this is just a map of the vegetation zones in Canada. I'm not sure how many of you would be familiar with it, but basically a large part of the country is covered in forests, essentially apart from the kind of Arctic north and the prairies in the south. But most of the other vegetation zones are dominated by forest ecosystems. And kind of just zooming in on Alberta, and this is using the Canada Vegetation Zones data set. You can see that most of the province is dominated by boreal forest, and then there's the parkland and prairies in the south, and some of the kind of foothills vegetation by the Rocky Mountains. So Alberta have their own vegetation classification system, and that classifies the vegetation into 6 natural regions in Alberta. Again, the boreals, the dominant region, covers about 58% of the province, and then the rest of the forest in the province occurs in the foothills and the Rocky Mountain natural regions. These are further subdivided into subregions, and yeah, the subregions aren't important for today, but the point of this slide is just to show the kind of complexity and the diversity of the forest landscape. These zones can further be divided depending on the species assemblages, like the different plants that are there, the different animals that are there, the different climate, soil, physical features. So when you're talking about the boreal forest, you're still talking about a very complex system that has a lot going on in it. So I'm just going to go into, have a slightly deeper look into the 3 natural regions that are kind of dominated by forests within Alberta. And the biggest, of course, is the boreal natural region, boreal. Excuse my accents if you don't understand some of what I say. So the boreal is characterized by short summers, long cold winters, and vast deciduous, mixedwood, and coniferous forests that are interspersed with extensive wetlands. So you have forests and wetlands of different ages, different sizes, and with different climate zones over the area that kind of creates a whole bunch of different habitats and different niches for various species, many of which, or most of which you guys would probably be familiar, a lot of which are new to me. But yeah, so in the wetlands, you get a lot of you get the river otters, the American beavers, the caribou is an important species in the boreal. You get all sorts of quite a high rodent diversity and vertebrate diversity. So yeah, a very diverse landscape. The foothills are kind of transitional between the mountains and the boreal, and the species that occur there kind of reflect that transitional nature. So a lot of the species, like the mammal species that occur there, also occur in the boreal and also occur in the Rocky Mountains. But it's characterized by moist, cool climate where forests dominate. And again, deciduous and mixedwood forests are typical of the lower elevations, and then coniferous forests are prevalent at the higher elevations. Again, largely because of the kind of topographical gradient that you get in the foothills, you have a whole bunch of different habitats which then supports a bunch of different species of birds, mammals, and invertebrates. And that includes some of the threatened species in Alberta, again, the caribou, but also bull trout in the streams. And the trumpeter swan, I would need to double check, but it's either listed as threatened or used to be listed as threatened, but isn't anymore. Used to be, there you go. Thank you. So then the third natural region is the Rocky Mountain Natural Region. This natural region has the widest elevation range, the coolest summers, the shortest growing season, the highest mean annual precipitation, and the highest snowfall. It's got a highly varied topography, which again creates variable habitat for rich forest fauna. And here we get a lot more grizzlies. It's a bigger part of kind of the grizzly range, and then you get the bighorn sheep and the mountain goats that occur in the mountains, swifts that nest almost exclusively in the cliffs of the Rockies, and a lot of species that ranges extend kind of north of America. It's the northern range of a lot of species that occur in the USA. So focus a little bit on caribou. Caribou are a threatened species in Canada and Alberta. So in Canada, they're listed under the Species at Risk Act, and in Alberta under the Wildlife Act, both listed as threatened. So there's several things that make it an important species for conservation. One is that they're just a pretty iconic species for Canada. The other is that they're relatively wide-ranging, or very wide-ranging, and even though their numbers are quite small, their habitat requirements are quite large, and they range over areas that influence multiple stakeholders. So from industry to indigenous peoples, federal and provincial governments all kind of have to come together to essentially try and protect caribou in Alberta. They're also highly sensitive to disturbance. So there are certain species that respond well to human disturbance, right? So like crows and ravens, and in Africa, like leopards, for example, kind of can be found anywhere. Like they're really good at hiding, but they're super wide-ranging, but they don't necessarily get that negatively impacted just by the presence of people, whereas caribou are different. So it's kind of really important what happens within their critical habitat. There are two subtypes in Alberta that we recognize, the boreal and the mountain. The boreal are kind of, there's 12 known herds within Alberta, and the mountain caribou in the southwest, there are 3 known herds, and at least 4 to 6 herds have become fairly recently extirpated, which means they're which means they're locally extinct in that area. So those herds have, for the most, pretty much disappeared. I think there's somewhere, there's a chance there might be 1 or 2 individuals left, but they've pretty much disappeared. So their range used to extend into the USA, but they don't occur there anymore. And the southernmost herds in the Rockies have also disappeared. It's pretty sad. So caribou and forestry, they are highly sensitive to the disturbance caused by forestry, either through clear cutting or through access roads. So essentially what happens is that, so caribou rely quite heavily on old growth forests, particularly in the winter, because the old growth forests are where lichen grows, and lichen is their kind of primary food source in winter. And yeah, if old growth forests get cut down, caribou struggle to survive the winter, and their population numbers decrease. Also, what happens with forestry is forestry roads are created, access roads to these areas. Those roads are then used by predators, which makes the caribou more vulnerable to predation than they would ordinarily be. And I read an article recently, it was from BC, but it was suggesting that there's some caribou herds that have been essentially separated from the threat of predation for so long that they don't really have a response to seeing wolves. They kind of just freeze, which is not something you want to do when wolves are hunting you. But it's because wolves just generally don't venture to where they occur up high in the mountains in the old growth forest. So with clear cutting and with the creation of these roads, predators have access to where the caribou are, but also clear cutting of forest creates a kind of proliferation of deciduous, like early successional plants, which like sprout up right after the forest has been cut, and that attracts moose and deer, and moose and deer attract wolves. The wolves get there, it's harder to catch moose and deer, so they catch caribou, and the caribou numbers get disproportionately affected by predation as a result. Okay, so I'm going to have a look at forestry now, kind of a slightly deeper dive into the industry. So this is kind of like the Wikipedia introduction to forestry in Canada, and I'll go into a little bit more detail for Alberta, because forests are generally, they're public land, they're generally therefore managed by the provinces. So about 39% of Canada, as you saw in the earlier map, is covered by forests, and this equates to about 9% of the world's forests. Over 90% of the forests in Canada are publicly owned and therefore controlled by the provinces and territories. And approximately half of that is allocated for logging. Canada is one of the largest producers of wood product in the world, and it's considered a global leader in sustainable forestry practices. So modern sustainable practices in the 20th and 21st century are said to have replaced the 18th and 19th century deforestation by European settlers. So sustainability ideas kind of have infiltrated forestry in the last couple of decades. And Canada boasts more than 36% of the world's certified forests, and we'll get into the certification in a little bit, but having only 9% of the world's forests and but 35% of the world's certified forests is quite a good brag if you're Canadian, or just in general actually, but if you're Canadian government too. So this map, it comes out better than I thought it would, but this is showing forestry in Alberta. So forestry in Alberta is based on an area-based tenure system. And this map shows the forest management units in Alberta that the forested land in the province is split into. And a forest management unit is an area of forested public land designated under the Forests Act as an administrative unit to manage timber. The blue areas are just the protected areas, and I've just overlaid that layer on there because technically harvesting isn't supposed to be occurring in protected areas. So there are 3 forest tenure types in Alberta. Forest management agreements are kind of like the big one. Then you get timber quotas and timber permits. And this map shows the forest management agreements that occur, I think this is as of March 2022. It shows the forest management agreements that occur within the FMUs, and you'll be able to see that some of the forest management agreements cover more than one FMU. So this example is the Alberta Pacific Forest Industries FMA, or ALPAC, and that consists of 11 FMUs. So ALPAC essentially have the right to harvest within that entire area, but they can also sell those rights to quota holders. And ALPAC, they currently have 7 quota holders for coniferous timber. So you can get a quota for the type of wood that you're harvesting, as well as the amount and the area that you're harvesting in. So a little bit of a shallow dive into Alberta's forest laws and policies. The primary legislation that governs forestry in Alberta is the Forests Act. There are other acts that are important, but this is the primary one. Essentially, within the Forests Act, forests are kind of viewed as timber resource. So, and that's how the Forest Act kind of legislates for forests, as looking at sustainability in terms of producing sustainable yield of forest products in Alberta. Under the Forest Act, there are various forest regulations. I'm not going to really go into those, and those are supported by guidelines and policies and manuals. The regulations get more specific in setting kind of the framework for what's allowed in the forestry industry, and then the guidelines, policies, and directives get even more specific in determining the kind of like the numbers that are allowed in terms of harvest, what you need to do as a forestry industry in terms of reporting what you've harvested, when, and all of those kind of details. They're all outlined in those documents. So the Environmental Law Centre, they did a review of the Forest Act and its regulations, and they've come up with a list of key gaps that they've found with the Forest Act and regulations, if viewing it from the perspective of managing forests as ecosystems, as opposed to just kind of timber resource areas. So the first is a lack of ecosystem-based management principles. So the concept of ecosystems has recently been added to the preamble of the Forests Act, but it's not really carried into the body of the legislation. So there's no actual legislation to ensure that ecosystems or even cultural and indigenous perspectives, which I think I mentioned now, are included in decisions in the forest industry. So yeah, there's no public participation provisions within the legislation. So for example, within the forest management agreements, which govern how a company is going to manage a land, the area of land, the FMUs, for 20 years, there's no public participation in the process of developing those FMAs. It's between the government and industry. And yeah, indigenous peoples aren't involved, and kind of neither is anyone else. So they flag that as an issue. They also flag a lack of accountability mechanisms within the legislation related to reporting and information sharing, monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. There's no third-party monitoring and assessment of forest management planning, and there's limited environmental assessment within the forest industry. So what does this all mean for sustainable forestry? There's no real agreed definition for sustainable forestry, but there's a definition for sustainable forest management from 1993. I think it's from some European forestry body, which basically says it's the stewardship and use of forest and forest land in a way that maintains their biological diversity, productivity, regeneration capacity, vitality, and their potential to fulfill relevant ecological, economic, and social functions at various levels, and does not cause damage to other ecosystems. So I mentioned earlier forests that Canada makes up for 36% of the certified forests globally. About 3/4 of Canada's managed crown forest land is certified, at least one sustainable forest management standard. And these are essentially market incentives which benefit forest companies seeking to demonstrate responsible resource management and consumers considering sustainably sourced forest products in their buying decisions. There are 3 organizations in Canada that provide forest management certifications. These are the Canadian Standards Association, the Forest Stewardship Council, and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. All 3 standards are meant to set high thresholds and comply with forest management laws and regulations, show customers they are buying products originating from forests that meet comprehensive standards, issue certificates only after a thorough review and determination of conformity with the standards by third-party auditors, and consider global and Canada-specific forestry issues. The standards are not meant to be static. They are regularly revised to keep pace with new knowledge and emerging concerns in global and local forest industries. And new standards are developed to reflect changing market needs. So almost all of Alberta's forests are certified for sustainability, but only through 2 of those certification systems that I mentioned earlier, the FSC and the SFI. The FSC, there's only one company, ALPAC, the area I mentioned earlier. They're the one company that are FSC certified. And then the boreal forest, pardon me. And the SFI, there are 10 different companies within Alberta who have SFI certification, and these are predominantly in the boreal and the foothills forests. So I'm going to have a little look at the differences between the FSC and the SFI. The FSC was developed in 1994 after the 1992 Earth Summit, and it was developed by representatives from environmental, social, government, and industry groups. It was a kind of a joint thing in response to environmental concerns around the forestry industry. FSC standards and indicators are mandatory and administered by an independent third party. They are internationally recognized and implemented. So the FSC is a global organization. They're based on performance-based measures. So what the company actually does, which will become relevant. They have a set of detailed ecological indicators. They have stringent guidelines in many areas of environmental protection, and they have social criteria focusing on local communities and indigenous peoples, and a chain of custody certification. The SFI, on the other hand, was developed in response to the FSC by industry. I think I can't remember the name, but it's the American Forestry kind of group. The landowner who signed up to the SFI has the choice of either first-party audit, which is self-administered, a second-party audit, administered by an industry trade group, or a third-party audit, and they get to choose the indicators that are listed within the SFI. They get to choose which ones they want audited. The SFI is, as I said, only used in North America. It's largely focused on the adoption of management systems. So, like I said, the FSC is performance-based. These are based on what the company says it's going to do in their FMAs. And as I mentioned, most indicators are general and optional. There aren't very stringent guidelines. There are no criteria focusing on local communities or indigenous peoples. There's mention that companies are recommended to engage with local and indigenous communities, but it's not mandatory. And there's no chain of custody certification. So using the definition for sustainable forest management, it's perhaps not surprising that most environmental organizations are more supportive of companies that have FSC certification rather than SFI certification. And this is the case globally and kind of across Alberta, and is one of the reasons that that we and other environmental NGOs will recommend, if you're going to go buy wood products, that they are FSC certified as opposed to SFI certified. And another point on that is the labeling that the two certification systems kind of have. Is the SFIs can be quite confusing in that wood can be harvested unsustainably, but part of the process of producing a product might be sustainable, and therefore it gets a sticker for that. So it can be a little bit difficult to navigate, especially as a consumer who might not know a lot about the different certification systems. So based on these systems and based on the review of the Forest Act and regulations, the ELC recommend changes to law and policy within Alberta Forestry. And this is that ecosystem-based management principles should be incorporated into the legislation to move from managing forests as a timber supply to managing forest ecosystems, where timber supply is just one factor that you consider in their management. Opportunities for public participation and increased transparency in tenure decisions. So particularly with FMAs and quota dispositions, they believe there should be feedback into those decisions. Annual allowable cut decisions, the amount of trees that are cut down by the company a year, and forest management decisions should be set in legislation. There should be a range of monitoring and enforcement mechanisms in the legislation. So some of those exist within the FSC, but not within the legislation and regulations. So it's not the law. As well as third-party monitoring assessment for forest management plan. moving on to a little bit of what we do at CPAWS. So our broad mission is we seek to achieve conservation of public lands and protection of parks and wilderness in Alberta through science, collaboration, and community engagement. The boreal covers a large part of our focus area, and as such, public forested land is a major focus for us. Moon Creek is an example of a reactionary project that CPAWS was involved with a couple of years ago. In 2021, the West Fraser Mills Forest Company proposed a spatial harvest plan to log about 2,500 hectares of timber. But this area, this plan was going to potentially impact the critical habitat of both woodland caribou, 2 herds, and the Athabasca rainbow trout, which are also threatened and listed both federally and provincially. And only 12% of the remaining Alapesh herd range was considered undisturbed. So actually finding undisturbed caribou habitat in Alberta is really difficult. So when you do know where it is, it's essential that it is protected because they are so sensitive to disturbance. So these are maps that my colleague Ryan made at the time. On the left, in the green, I hope you can see the maps, that showed at the time, the current undisturbed caribou habitat in the proposed harvest area. And on the right, it showed the proposed harvest and what was left. I don't know if I have what was left of the undisturbed, what would have been left of the undisturbed habitat had the harvesting gone forward. So CPAWS, through a active public campaign and through creating this analysis and this report, which was released publicly but also sent to the government of Alberta and to the forestry industry, managed to influence the discussion between government and industry, and this resulted in the pausing. That's I guess the caveat, not the permanent ending, but the pausing of harvesting in that area, and the company agreed not to carry on with harvesting in the area until proper land use planning has taken place for the area. And I'm not sure how familiar you'll be with the land use planning process in Alberta, but it's something that has been ongoing for quite a while now, and kind of gets continuously delayed. There's 7 land use, like broad land use zones within Alberta, and 2 land use plans have been developed. And the point of the whole process is that all stakeholders within that zone get together and have a say in what the land use is going to be going forward within that area. But the problem is that those plans just have taken inordinately long to develop, and it's kind of unknown when the next plans will be released. But at the very least, the company has promised not to harvest in that area until there is an actual land use plan for that area. So that's good. Pardon me. So the Conservation Areas Network project is a more proactive project that CPAWS has been involved with. And this is a collaboration between 2 FSC certified companies. One I mentioned earlier, ALPAC, and the other is Mystic Management in Saskatchewan. So the project area extends into Saskatchewan. And it's a collaboration between those 2 companies, Ducks Unlimited and CPAWS Northern Alberta and Saskatchewan chapters. It's a project where the companies are committing to implement a suite of responsible forest management practices, many of which go beyond what's required even by FSC standards. And this includes identification and protection of important ecosystems in the areas where they operate. So it could result in the creation of new protected areas, or what are called other effective area-based conservation measures, which are basically areas that are like protected areas, but you can't call them protected areas. If you have questions about those, then we can get to them. But yeah, through this project, hopefully new protected areas will be created within the ALPAC and Mystic operational zones, and they open to following modern and more ecologically sound forestry practices within those areas. So if you'd like to know anything more about what CPAWS Northern Alberta does, our website is cpawsnab.org, which will take you to this page here. And this is actually, the website's been recently updated, and it includes all the work that we do, the areas that we work in, how you can get involved if you're interested, as well as engagement material, blogs, media releases, all that kind of good stuff, and the various campaigns that CPAWS are involved with. And I also left some propaganda on your tables, those of you in the room. Please feel free to take all of them, yeah. They're all related to campaigns that we're busy with at the moment, or we have been in the past, and also just some nice stickers to stick on your car, or give to kids and grandkids to stick on their cars, maybe. Cool, thank you.
Are you okay to take some questions?
Yes, please.
Super, okay. So, I'm an ex-forestry official kind of person, mostly policy in the last 20 years. Anyway. Okay, better? Okay, so when it comes to consultation, the forest industry does consult with First Nations and neighbors and stuff like that, right? It's a requirement. I think it's by policy, not legislation, but I haven't read the legislation in about 15 years, so I'm kind of fuzzy on exactly what it says, but it's practice.
Yeah.
And having said that, one of the biggest problems they have is political pressure on deputy ministers and things like that that cause the policies to get bent a little bit, maybe a lot even.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest concerns that's out there and poorly understood is that 100% of the unprotected areas would be logged at some point. That's a little disturbing, but nevertheless, that's the way it was explained to me some years ago.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
That's news to me.
And so when it comes to protecting ecosystems, once a forest is harvested, will it come back to the exact same ecosystem it was? Would the plants and herbs and whatever be the same? No. And when you introduce climate change, that's going to drive the ecosystem in different directions that nobody knows where that's going, right?
Yeah.
So that's a tough call. Sustainability, well, I guess the clear-cutting process or system that is in place, in order to cut, we'll back up a little bit, the harvesting happens in about in locales, based on a 20-year cut plan.
Yeah.
And half of the forest is harvested the first time around, with exclusions for sensitive areas. And once that forest that was harvested has reached about 8 feet in height, then the leaf blocks could be cut. The leaf blocks
Yeah.
would be cut. So, and then they move on to a different area. So over between a 100 and 200 year period, that area would be harvested.
Yeah.
Depending. If it's burnt, then
Yeah.
all bets are off, right?
Yeah.
So who knows what's going to happen with that?
Yeah.
What else? I had a number of things to consider as you went through your talk, but I didn't want to interrupt.
I'm sure you had lots with
Here and
your
there,
background.
here and
Yeah.
there, but the big one is that consultation is done with First
Yeah.
Nations.
Yeah.
But it's consultation. It's not doing as you're told.
Yeah. Yeah.
So biodiversity is a consideration in that mix.
Yeah.
Reforestation is a mandatory sort of thing. The genetics standard is a standard. It can't be messed with. That you have to comply with the policy as it's written. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's complex.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The engagement with Indigenous peoples, I think from what you said and from my reading of the ELC document, it's kind of with a lot of these things, practice is often a lot better than what's legislated or what's in policy. Would you know, where it's kind of, it's much harder, it's much more difficult to write things, as I understand it, into legislation, than it is for people on the ground to change what they're doing. And
That's right.
Yeah.
So
to
the
kind of get out.
legislation is sometimes intentionally vague,
Yeah.
and then where they clarify it is in policy.
Yeah.
And companies have to submit their plans, share them with the public.
Yeah.
They have an open house and accept comments and include modifications to the cut plan where appropriate. Sometimes it just can't be changed. It's difficult to change.
Yeah.
But compliance with policy is mandatory unless they're able to convince the ADM that doesn't make sense for them.
Yeah, there's an example, I think, from southern Alberta, which illustrates the difficulty in kind of ensuring that proper standards are met with regards to engagement. So there's certain forest companies who will set up an engagement meeting, but they'll advertise it on maybe one Facebook page, and very soon before the meeting, and they'll hold the meeting in a place that's relatively inaccessible for a lot of people. So it's one of those cases where it's up to the people who are running either the engagement or whatever it is to do it properly. And and I think the point of the promoting changes to policy and legislation is to include language which specifies more precisely what you'd need to do to ensure that you meet criteria for proper engagement that allows
better clarity on that would be good. I think one of the gaps is clearly caribou. In Alberta, it's not just, well, the cut blocks don't have that much effect. They mimic wildfire. The one that really messes it up is seismic and well sites and permanent roads. Wolves find the seismic line, and there's so many out there that they can follow the shortest path to caribou herd, and that's that, right? Lunch is on.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's very difficult to deal with, and given time and what the petroleum industry is doing, driven by Department of Energy, of course, that caribou have a very difficult time surviving.
Yeah, absolutely. The seismic lines issue is interesting, and it kind of relates to the restoration point that you made earlier, which is like, can a site restore itself to what it was? In that, so from the South African perspective, I come from like desert landscapes, which they'll get cultivated at some point by some farmer who thought there was a chance he could farm the desert, and they ultimately fail. But when you drive through the landscape, the scars of all the cultivated fields, no matter when they were cultivated, are still there.
Sure.
Because the landscape's just not been able to recover on its own.
Yeah.
But then there are, there, and I think within forestry, there are active restoration efforts that are and can be made, which, as you say, will probably never mimic exactly what was there, but it can potentially get closer to it. And that's the same with some of the different selective harvesting practices that are being promoted now. So as instead of clear cutting an area, there's the science is pointing towards more selective harvesting, leaving stands or leaving individual trees which create habitat or create shade for other species to grow. So there has been of late at least more science which supports, I guess, a more complex but potentially more useful way of harvesting that can result in an ecosystem that better resembles what was there before.
Right.
Yeah.
Having leaf blocks within a cut block of regeneration works quite well. But if you have a small patch of mature trees in the middle of a cut block, you just blow down. It's pointless.
Yeah.
I have a question from online.
Oh, yeah.
We have Roger. In southern Alberta, logging in the Highwood watershed has major implications for water, and West Fraser has in fact put their logging plans on hold due to the drought conditions in the area. Do these issues converge in a similar way in northern Alberta, to your knowledge?
I think so. I think in southern Alberta, the issue of the drought is probably more prevalent. And if you would like more information on what's going on in southern Alberta, the CPAWS Southern Alberta website have a story map which they've created with the various projects that they are working on there. But yeah, my knowledge of specific projects in northern Alberta is pretty limited at the moment. So yeah, I'm not sure if I could.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Another question from Alita. Would you comment on the recent Spray Lake decision from the provincial government, she thinks, on harvesting on the eastern slopes and the protected areas?
I won't comment.
It's a tough crowd.
Yeah, I won't comment personally on that, but I'm almost certain that CPAWS Northern and Southern Alberta have released a press release on that decision. If Northern Alberta wasn't involved, then certainly Southern Alberta. So that press release would be able to give you far better information than I could at this point. I hope that's...
That's the intelligent way of saying, I don't think I quite know.
Yeah.
When they allocate timber resources to the various companies, what consideration is now given and more recently given to forest fire areas? And we hear about vast numbers of acres that have burned.
Yeah.
And secondly, is there enough emphasis put on harvesting burnt timber?
Yes, I think that's, I think our friend will be able to answer that better than I can. Yeah, I'll just start by saying that the forest management agreements, because they're so long-term, they haven't changed as a result of particularly the recent wildfires, but operational plans from governments do. I think that's correct, and that includes like annual allowable cuts. They change in the areas that they harvest change, and I think there've been efforts with the government's the response is basically to harvest more bigger trees. So there's essentially a dispute between whether big stands of big trees result in worse fires or not. And Alberta Forestry and Canadian Forestry, their implementation of ecosystem-based management practices in the last couple of decades, the primary thing that they've done is to try and mimic wildfires in the way that they harvest anyway. And I think there's adaptation, at least in the operational plans, particularly now with last year's severe fires and this year's coming up. I don't know.
I think we have a question over here.
Okay, so burnt timber is not a very good resource, depending on how badly it's burnt. Sometimes you have fires that creep along the bottom and just burn the roots, and most of the tree is okay. So what they do is they put it up for bid. If it's a solid company that owns that area, then it's mandatory that they go salvage it. If it's an area that is designated as pulpwood, say Alpac or any of the other big ones with pulp factories, they can't use burnt wood. Any charcoal in the system at all throws off the quality, and so it's nixed. And then they have the opportunity to put it up for bid if anybody wants it. So that's where you get a bit of high grading, where they take the bigger trees and turn that into lumber, and the smaller stuff that's expensive to get and not very productive for a mill would be left as habitat.
I have a question. Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah.
My question is, I thought sustainability meant what do you do to replace the trees that you have cut? And nothing has been mentioned about that. So what regulations are in place that if you cut down 6 trees, you have to plant 10 or 12 or double? Like what is the rule about reforestation?
Yeah, so there's, in my presentation, there's the, I think it's a timber regulation that specifies, one of the documents specifies restoration requirements for companies. So those are specified. I don't know if they necessarily specify, like, if you cut down 1 tree, you need to plant 2. I think that would be probably discussed in the development of the FMA. But what I know is that restoration is required by forestry companies. The specifics I'm not too sure about.
Actually, I had a different question, but since Connie asked that one, I remember seeing an article, reading it or seeing it, in New Brunswick. There was one organization that recommended not replanting, that it was better to just let it naturally regrow. Is that a common practice?
So yeah, it's an interesting one, and it goes back to the restoration issue. And I'm not expert on this yet, but yet, hopefully. But one of the issues with a lot of restoration activities is that it's within the forest company's interest to plant the most valuable timber, right? And I think I'm not entirely sure of like the details that occur within the development of the FMA, but what can often happen is that a diverse forest is cut down, and then a coniferous forest, for example, is planted. So just one species, and there are instances where you essentially get a monoculture where forestry basically becomes like a farm. So in that case, leaving it to just naturally regenerate might actually result in a more diverse landscape that represents the original forest.
I think that might have been the reason they recommended it, because it does regenerate in a, you know, more natural ecosystem. Curious about one thing, about your third or fourth slide, you were showing the different areas, and Alberta was broken into about 3 major areas, the boreal, the prairie, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But then your next slide, you showed all the subzones, and in the very northeast corner, something I'd never seen before, it was a little brown patch, and it was called Tazen or something like that?
Yeah, Canadian Shield. Yeah, I'm not sure of the names. I think the Tazen is maybe the sub.
It was one of the subzones.
Sub-region names.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What is it, Chris?
It's a sub-region based on geoclimatic considerations. It's basically Canadian Shield.
Yeah.
So it's different than the boreal? Obviously, yeah. It's, oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so it's just barren land, basically. Yeah. Just rock, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
I brought my assistant yesterday.
Yeah, sorry. Sheila and I used to be certified to do regen surveys for Alberta. So anyway, the standard is that in order to get sign off, the company has to do surveys on the lands that were harvested and ensure there's emergeable species every meter or so. You do millacre plots, and it has to be at least one tree that will survive to adulthood, right? Mm-hmm. Aspen blocks that, say, alpaca would be harvesting typically come back all by themselves. Yeah. They come up dense as hair on a dog's back quite often, but through natural thinning, eventually they have a stand similar to what was there before. But if it's a spruce stand or mixed wood, spruce and aspen, or pine and aspen, those need a little help. Naturally, they will come back to spruce eventually, depending on fire activity, more like in the time frame of 200 years, because the aspen typically takes over, and it takes about 100 years for the spruce to break through the canopy and the aspen die off and the spruce survive. But because it's such a valuable species, companies are required to plant within 1 year the spruce to make the block.
Is that strictly for economic reasons, though?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, everything's about economics. Okay. Any other questions on regen?
Yeah, we got one here.
So Dr. Bell, I'm not sure if you would know this one or not, but you were speaking about the caribou, and I was wondering, do you know if Alberta has a plan, a comprehensive plan, or if they're about to have a comprehensive plan to protect the caribou, or is it pretty much a done deal? Are we going to lose them?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the details. I think there's a draft plan for the province, and then there's sub-regional plans which relate to specific herds within the province. I think, and this is just trying to remember the kind of vast array of stuff I've read over the last 4 months, but I believe at least one sub-regional plan has been released, and there are sub-regional committees that representatives from CPAWS and all other stakeholders sit on, and therefore have some input into those plans. But I believe at least one sub-regional plan has been released. As part of kind of, because caribou are listed under the Species at Risk Act, the provinces have to develop recovery plans and essentially conservation plans for them. It's just there's usually not really a time limit on when those need to be done by, and it's there's a lot of potential complications with them. But did you want to comment on?
So this is a very difficult point that Alberta has with economics as compared to the federal plans. The recovery plans are mandatory according to federal regulation. And so all of the, I don't know if they're formal already or not, but there's a number of policies in place to address that. The one was the cut block size. Depending which region you're in, cut block sizes are mandated to be larger so that you don't go back again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the roads are closed, rollback of brush on top, or removal of bridges and whatever it takes to keep people from the two-legged predators from helping themselves. It slows down the four-legged predators as well. The one fly in the ointment is that wolves are resilient, that you get the poplar growing up in the multi-species situations where you have aspen and willow, you get moose. And with moose, you get wolves and caribou coming over for dinner. The one that's more difficult to address has been the seismic lines throughout Alberta, where many places you have 3D seismic that goes for miles and miles and miles through caribou, a seismic line every 100 meters. And if that's not enough, then they put in diagonals to tighten it up. A oil reservoir can be as small, coral reef reservoir can be as small as 100 meters in diameter. If you miss it, you miss $20 million worth of oil. So there's a high propensity for people to find a way to put in a lot of seismic lines, and they don't recover. My experience after looking at them, seismic lines are 40, 50, 60 years old, haven't recovered, partially because of soil conditions, and more often because they're continually used by people on ATVs, quads, snowmobiles, hunters, recreational people. It's a real problem.
Yeah, I think that's at least part of the reason that there are some conservation organizations now who are trying to act, and Indigenous peoples. I know in BC, I'm not entirely sure in Alberta, who actively go out and try to restore seismic lines by planting trees within those areas, but you can't. They're just so extensive that you can't go and plant all of them up. Yeah.
We're on. I just wanted to. So you said that they're actively reclaiming them. Like, is that so? My father and my uncles were farmers in northern Alberta. When I was a child, they were paid in the winter to go out and line slash and make sure that all those lines were wide open.
Huh?
And when like 10 years ago when I was up there running around doing service work and stuff, you're right. Like, they're everywhere. I could drive from Nelson to Fort McMurray and just drive over roads. So I can attest to what he's saying, that they're there, they're never going away. So what you're talking about, is that a recent thing? Because, okay.
Yeah, so the example that I saw was a very recent project in BC that's been spearheaded by Indigenous people, so it's within a First Nations territory in BC. It's within their territory, and it's essentially with the resources that they have, what they can do.
Only in BC?
That I know of, yeah. I'm not sure what active restoration is happening in Alberta, but yeah, for me, when moving here, that's one of the most shocking things I've ever seen. I spend a lot of time on maps, just looking at like Google Earth imagery, and you zoom in anywhere in the boreal forest, and it is just crisscrossed with seismic lines. It's
We have one more question online from Roger. First Nations in BC, the Statimek Nation in the Lillooet region says that the fires a few years ago burned so hot that the trees died right down to the roots. The trees end up falling over after a couple of years. Have we seen this in Alberta?
Yeah, again, not too sure, but that's, as Chris was saying, the intensity of the fires is really important to how the area regenerates, reclaims, restores itself after the fire, and climate change has a massive impact on that, because trees are drier, fires are hotter, and I wouldn't be surprised if the same kind of thing has happened in Alberta. Yeah.
That looks like it's the end of the questions then? Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bell, so much. And it was great to have you here in person.
Yeah, thank you.
All the way from South Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a long flight, but
Yeah.
you're welcome.
It was great news to hear that Canada is a leader in sustainable forestry practices. Really, really good. But of course, we always have to keep improving.
Yeah.
Really appreciate how attractive your slides were and how clear they were, and your very kind and courteous manner all the way through this. Chris.
Thank you.
It was
Appreciate
CPAWS.
that.
I've heard a few presentations from CPAWS, and I'm always so impressed, and really, really grateful that your organization is there to inform us and to provide opportunities for us to get involved with the issues that are so near and dear to our hearts. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
And thank you, everybody, for coming. And Chris, for your knowledge. And I know, Sheila, you're full of information here, too, when it comes to forestry. So next month, we are having our Walk the Talks as usual. And Georgia can maybe tell us who's coming.
I definitely can tell you who's coming. So we're having a representative from the Edmonton International Airport. Her name is Marion Chevaux-Legris, and she's responsible for environmental, social, and governance aspects of their operation. So then in May, we're having a representative from Heidelberg Materials. That's an organization that runs the cement plant in Edmonton, and they're implementing carbon capture and linking it in to some of the storage as part of the plan. So, and then in June, we've got Andrew Tate, a local speaker and environmentalist, who's going to be talking about conservation.
Thank you, everybody on Zoom, for your questions and for sticking with us. It has been a fantastic event, so we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much.